When we talk about the double bind of difference, we run into a problem. The problem is that not every decision or policy that disadvantages women is immediately, obviously discriminatory, biased, or bigoted. In certain cases, ways of acting on the part of companies or other institutions that disadvantage women seem to be in the rational self-interest of the company. To illustrate that, I'd like to talk about something that often comes up, and that is the issue of equal work for equal pay. A lot of times you'll hear this claim that there's this gender gap in wages. Okay. So the idea is that men and women working at the same job, right, presumably with the same level of skill, etc., right, will receive different wages. On the average, for the same job, men will receive more wages than women. I talked to someone a number of years ago who argued that this is actually oversimplified. In fact, it's not, in her words, it's not a gender gap, it's a mothers and everyone else gap. She said single women, or married women who don't have children, make pretty much the same as men. There's a very slight gap, right, but not much. She said the real gap is between mothers and everyone else being men, single women, right, and married women with no children. Now, I would immediately point out, right, that you notice I said men in general, and that includes men with children, men without children. Okay? So there is a gap between men with children and women with children. Okay? Or you might say between fathers and mothers. Right? But she said the real gap is between mothers and everyone else. Here we run into a difficulty. Suppose that we've got someone who's hiring for a company, right? So there's an executive position. And the person in charge of the hiring is Miss Smith. Now notice, I deliberately said Miss Smith. Right? Miss Smith is not married, does not have children, and does not have any intention of getting married or having children anytime soon. Now, Miss Smith is looking at two candidates, Mrs. Jones and Mr. Carstairs. And let's assume, as people do when they come up with these examples, that in every other respect, right, the two seem identical. Right? They have similar schooling, similar experience, similar skills. There's really no way to differentiate the two, right? Except for this fact that one is a married woman and let's say one is a married man. Well, what might Miss Smith do? She might think to herself, well, statistically, in our society, women are more likely to end or suspend their career outside the home when they have children than men. Now, why is this relevant? Well, it means that if Miss Smith hires Mrs. Jones rather than Mr. Carstairs, she's taking an increased risk that the company will invest a certain number of years of training, etc., in Mrs. Jones, at the end of which, after a few years, Mrs. Jones will resign, will basically become pregnant, resign, right, and spend the next few years, say until her kids go to kindergarten, right, as a full-time parent. Right? Or not, i.e., not working outside the home. Of course, it's possible that Mr. Carstairs would be the one who would have children, right, and decide to devote himself full-time to parenting until the kids go to kindergarten, or longer. Right? I know a couple, right, in which the father homeschools the child, while the mother, right, has the career that brings in money for the children. However, statistically, it's less likely that Mr. Carstairs will do that than Mrs. Jones. Right? So absent a very detailed inquiry into their plans, background, etc., Miss Smith might think, well, given the risks and given that I don't have any other reason to differentiate, I'm going to hire Mr. Carstairs, right, because we are, given the statistics, more likely to get a bigger long-term return on our investment, right? Because this one risk is not there. So you notice what's going on here. Ms. Smith does not dislike married women. She does not think married women are less able to do a good job. She's simply saying that statistically, right, married women tend to behave in a certain way, which Ms. Smith may have no problem with, right? But it does mean a reduced return on the company's investment. So this is one of the things we have to think about. Right? When we talk about the double bind of difference, at times, right, it seems like the double bind of difference is based on simply a shrewd observation, right, of how things tend to work in our society, rather than any animosity towards or prejudice against women. This is a problem we need to look at. But Smith has an answer to this problem. And to understand her answer, let's go on to the next segment where we'll talk about the theme of domesticity.